Right, welcome back to Shedtune, and I'm in someone else's shed today, Darrall Taylor, and he's going to have a look at this crank for us that's come out of Dom's scooter. And if you saw the last video, you'll know that we took it on the dial gauge, and we know it's got a bend in it. It's been TIG welded, and normally with a TIG welded crank, you'd throw them away. But as we're here, we thought we'd see if we could save it and see what options are available. Right, so first things first, what are you doing?
Well, don't worry, I'll clean it for you. Don't you and Dom worry yourself about bringing something to clean, mate. Well, after a bit of a clean up, first thing that we can spot on here is that you've been having some rubbing on the side of the web here.
Yeah, we saw.
Because that's dry side, that means that it's been rubbing on the oil seal plate or on the inside of the crankcase in that area.
Correct.
And that's something that can be checked with a feeler gauge to check for clearance down the back of this web here.
Yeah.
If it's too tight, it can be as a result of the oil seal plate being fitted with too thick a hairline gasket that moves outwards and rubs.
Yeah.
Or it can be that the bearing inside of the crankcase is a little bit too deep, and a shim can be added in this area here.
Yeah.
To space it outwards.
Okay.
And that'll give you additional clearance. But you can just check that simply with a feeler gauge. You can run that down the back of the down the side of the web. Just down there once it's installed.
Yeah.
And check for a clearance. And this side, on the dry side, I tend to look for around about 0.5 millimetre because you have less flex on that side.
With you? Yeah.
So you want 0.5 mil down there, and that's why that's left that rub mark on there.
Yeah, it's funny enough, when we were looking at it last night, you could see where one of the Allen key bolts was just sitting a little bit proud.
And they do sit proud.
Yeah.
That's something you've got to watch for on some of the oil seal plates that are on the market. The countersinks sit a bit too tall.
Yeah.
So when you put your feeler gauge in, you need to swing the feeler gauge kind of forward and back, because you're not checking the clearance to the plate on its own, you're checking it to the heads of the countersink screws, which are there and there in terms of position.
Right.
So swing it back and forth like that to check for the clearance. Another point to note on the crank is where the oil seal runs on this part section of the crank here.
Yeah.
Before considering whether or not to refurbish or recondition an existing crank, it's good policy just to check that this hasn't got a really deep indentation or groove in there, because if it is, it's not going to seal next time, so it's time to chuck it away if you've got a really deep groove on there. Whilst you're at it, you can check the splines on the end of the crank here. Make sure that the dry sprocket sleeve is nice tight fit on there.
Yeah.
You can also check the centralisation of this thread hull. Sometimes they're a little bit off centre, sometimes the threads are pulled and damaged. On this side, you've got the seal area again, where the seal runs.
Yeah.
You've also got where the NU2205 type bearing, the inner sleeve runs on there. And
that's on the mag side.
That's on the mag side, yeah. As I rotate that, you can see there's a wear mark where the needle rolls have been running. And as you rotate round, you can sometimes see it run square, and it gets wider and narrower. And that's normally an indication when you've had a crank that's been slightly running out of true. So we're narrow here on the shadow.
Yeah, I can see it.
And that's probably about the width of the tip of that feeler gauge. And as we go around here, you see it's gone wider now.
Yeah.
We've got that width from there to there. That's normally a telltale sign. And it isn't necessarily that a crank is twisted. It can sometimes also be that in use the crank is being spragging in and out in use, because you've got a big long shaft and you've got a very heavyweight flywheel on this end, which can cause that oscillation. So moving on to the tip of the crank here, you can see a kind of witness mark here where the flywheel has been seated.
Yes.
And you see that where it's not seating there and where it's seating here. And this area here, because you've got maybe 20 different manufacturers around the world who are manufacturing crankshafts, and the angle of the cut that is done on that shaft at that angle there, and the tooling on a Monday morning compared to the tooling on a Friday afternoon, and then that shaft angle has then got to marry to the shaft angle, well, not the shaft angle, the taper angle that's on the flywheel. And as we know, there's probably 20 different manufacturers of flywheels out there, and we get an inconsistency between the angles of the two. So the flywheel, when it goes on there, always needs to be ground in, and you can use coarse or fine valve grinding paste. Many will remember this from days gone by. You've got the fine end and the coarse end.
That's it.
You can start off by lapping your flywheel's taper onto the crank, back forth until you get an even coloration on the end of the crank. And if you don't get that matched in, what can happen is the taper can be too big at this end, and the flywheel will rock back and forth, and you'll feel a vibration through your engine. If it's too tight at this end, as you tighten the nut down and you nip it down, it can physically crack the taper open on the flywheel.
Right.
So nipping it down, or if it's too tight at this end, it can split it open also. It's always worth checking this thread on the end of the crank for where the flywheel nut tightens down. Quite often they can be chewed up, and quite often sometimes cranks get knocked about in boxes or in packages. And if you look at the centre of the shaft and the thread section, you should be able to rotate that round and see that it's still square. Because if that end of that shaft is kinked like that and the nut tightens down at an angle, as it tightens down at an angle, the flat face of the base of the nut will rotate the end of that shaft with the threads on it over and want to crack and shear at this point here. So again, that's another area you want to look at if you're considering refurbishing an existing crank before you send it off to be done. And then the last one on the crank is the keyway section here. There's various woodruff keys on the market, and some of them are of various depths, and this I see as a regular problem. It means that when the woodruff key sits into the groove here, sometimes the key can sit too tall, and as a result of that, when you go to put the flywheel on, it won't allow it to seat down fully onto the taper. So you also need to check that it's got a really nice still square edge on it there. This key's there for the purpose of timing location. It hasn't got anything to do with whether your flywheel stays on or spins or comes off. It's just purely for timing. The taper does the job of holding it. So just having a little inspection on this crank, a bit of a check around it. This is just a 0.5mm crank shim, and I quite often use this just as a checking tool for checking the clearance gap between the rod and the crankshaft webs. This particular crank has got the rod plus 0.5mm shims already installed in there as well, and that shim still fits in there. What that actually means is that where the two 0.5mm shims are fitted, it means that we've got a 0.5mm total clearance. So it isn't a case of that we've got 0.25mm here and 25mm here. We've actually got like a quarter of that. We've got whatever 0.12, 0.12, 0.12, 0.12 at each side of the shim. So that's your total clearance. If you don't run a shim, then what you measure is your full clearance divided by 2. With shims, we've got the full clearance divided by 4.
And is that acceptable?
Yeah, that's. I regularly look for a clearance gap of around about 0.5mm. That allows oil ingress to migrate down the side of the web, down the side of the shims, and down the side of the rod to give adequate lubrication to the con rod and into the big end area. This has got a large cutout here to allow oil to come in, and these cutouts here as well to allow oil in. So that all adds to the lubrication of that big end area, and that 0.5mm clearance gap is what I typically look for myself also. Another quick check on the crank. We can check the width. So we're coming in to check with zeroed. Got a nice full flat surface there to grab onto. Because I was working around the pin here at this side.
Right with you.
40.49 there, so it's just a little bit wider at this point, and when we chuck it on the V blocks and the dial gauge, we may see this as our kind of sprag point. And 40.46 there, a little bit more at this side, just fractionally more. That's just an initial kind of basic check if someone at home has only got a vernier and they want to use that as a tool to be able to measure. That's one thing there. We can also then grab the steel rule. And we can just check across the top of the web
to make sure it's
using a bit of light. You can see we've actually got a little bit of light under the right hand side there. And then bring it round to the other side and we've got a little gap there. This isn't always the case that this means it's not out of true, because the crank web manufacturers don't always make perfect pairs. They will sometimes make this half of the crank web and put 100 of those into a trug, and they'll make 100 sides of this half and chuck that into a trug. They're not looking for perfection between matching the left to the right, and when they reach into the trug, they'll grab one of the lefts, one of the rights, and build a crank up
with you.
But this is another good provisional check. This is done, so I've got the pin mounted there. This is done at that kind of 45 to that, and that's checked at that point there, and you can see that gap below it where the light's coming through, hopefully.
Yeah, you can. Right, that's going to be the end of this video. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you learnt stuff. Don't forget, there's a link in the description to Darrall Taylor's various bits and pieces. So if you need it, contact him. Give us a like, a subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers.